So looking overall at the plan for jobs, you would say on unemployment measures and employment measures, it's been a success. Unemployment would have been 2.5 million higher if it had followed GDP. So furlough, big picture, sort of policies that coped with the crisis for the majority of people. I think you'd say that actually the plan for jobs did strikingly well. I think moving into sort of where are the challenges? Of course, that covered the majority of people. There are groups that have been overlooked in that, in particular, disabled people, people with sort of more mental health conditions. I think we'd want to be looking at certain groups like Meet Young People. The numbers have started to rise there. So I think those are just examples of some of the groups that haven't quite been covered by these sort of big policies that Plan for Jobs has brought in. So I would say when we're looking at what's next or where could we improve, I think the Plan for Jobs is just that. It was a plan for the crisis. And it's really important to keep it as that. It was a plan for crisis conditions. What we need now is a strategy for jobs and growth. That's quite a different thing. We need to assess this new environment that we find ourselves in. I know that we have some continuing pandemic impacts that are still being felt. But we definitely need a strategy that starts to assess that, looks at where that, like Tony mentioned about participation, there's a missing million people in the workforce who are not filling those vacancies, and we need a strategy that looks at that too. So I think there are lots of gaps that we now need to be addressing in a sort of more joined up strategy. I'll just jump in on an important point within this, and I think it's good to state this here, that the figures that we're giving, actually, in the last recession, 2008-9, we had a lot more data that we were actually able to see publicly. MPs were able to analyse, local authorities, Job Centre Plus, and people like ourselves, because we were actually able to see people moving around conditionality groups. We were able to see them moving into employment more easily. And actually, a lot of the questions that we have, and probably you have as a committee, we're actually not able to answer as well as we would like to, because actually with the introduction of universal credit, we aren't seeing those monthly figures being reported. So it is important if someone moved between JSA and ESA previously. We're not seeing that. We're also not seeing the same sets of data on that local level, because that data on benefit changes was available for local authority level and constituency level. That isn't currently sort of able to see, and all of us using the same set of stats on NOMAS would be able to sort of work together. And I think that's just an interesting framing point for some of this discussion today, that actually it would be good to have that richer level of data that we could all use. The data that we do have is very high quality, and it has been pushed as far as it can go. I mean, ONS has done a fantastic job, but I do think we're missing some of that data that we used to have, and we did have in the last recession. Our research with the Centre for Ageing Better did predict this rising longer-term unemployment amongst the over 50s, and we have, as everybody said, seen this drift into inactivity. But it's interesting, Neil, that you then linked it to restart, because, of course, conditionality of restart will only work for those over 50s in the benefit system. If people have decided, for example, if they're over 55 and have a private pension, they could have been drawing down from that in comparison to what they could have claimed under UC. That could be a very common sense choice for them. And conditionality and restart wouldn't affect them. So actually that might not be the trigger for the solution for that one. What we do need to look at is the impact on older people's finances in tandem with that as well. So if people have taken that route, what does that mean for their choices in later life, and also for the labour market and the employers that might need their skills in the labour market. It's always going to be better to engage people voluntarily in any scheme and to encourage them to improve their skills or to change careers than it is to mandate. But I mean, for other groups, ultimately there is a sort of rights and responsibilities sort of question there. That decrease in self-employment has hit men more than women, which is interesting. It's fallen across all age groups, so all age groups have seen a drop, but mostly for the biggest drop has been 25 to 49-year-olds within that. Obviously, we all know that we've seen the big rises in self-employment pre-pandemic, especially for disabled people and people from ethnic minority backgrounds. And during the pandemic, we saw those numbers fall less than for their peers. So disabled people fell less in self-employment than those who are non-disabled, for example. So there are some things that we want to look at there. I think I agree with Hannah sort of overall that it's about recategorization for some. It's about changing into other forms of employment. And I think overall, we have to work out, is this a supportive or hostile environment for self-employed people? Is the government taking a view that self-employment is good or bad? Because it does feel like, there are discouraging factors for people in self-employment. Is that intentional? And a combination between Treasury and DWP policy making it so, and is it unintentional? And actually, we want to have some more supportive policies in there for people who are in self-employment, particularly in those groups, as I mentioned before the pandemic, who were seemingly thriving in self-employed jobs like disabled people. So we know, I completely agree with Tony, and also the point that we were closing the disability employment gap before the pandemic. Some of that was due to reasons of people declaring disabilities in work and so on, but some of that was closing the gap, and actually that gap widened during the pandemic. And I think that's what we need to worry about. As I said before, the plan for jobs was about policies for the majority, not the overlooked groups, and that's where we need to come back to. Completely agree with Tony. That's where we need to spend investment. Devolution is definitely, you need to join up these services. You need to join up that support at the local level. But we know some of the bigger national programmes haven't fared so well for people with disabilities, which is why we did get the Work and Health programme, which is meant to be more targeted and more specific. So is that funded well enough? Is that moving people towards employment and the employment opportunities? I just wanted to flag the employment opportunities that are coming, not just the ones that exist today. We've talked a lot about the gig economy, self-employment, and I kept mentioning the large numbers of disabled people within those areas. Also, their jobs are more at risk of automation than any other group, disabled people. So if the committee is using this session for sort of scoping what should we look at, I know you've looked at the future of work before, but what is the impact of those trends in the labour market on specific groups like disabled people? Is the department planning ahead for that? Is there enough support into those jobs that are at risk of automation or with self-employment decreasing? Are we doing enough planning and support around that? I would counter no at the moment.
And with a shrinking workforce, potentially, is there grounds for more of an onus on employers, perhaps in partnership with BEIS or others, or local economic partnership, to go through what reasonable adjustments might work for someone who is seeking to take early retirement, for example?
That's exactly right. It's the good employer practices as well, as we keep saying. It's two sides. One is supporting people, but it's actually about the jobs and the employers and the support that they're providing for people to move into employment. But equally, there are other forms of employment too. So I think it's taking all of that into account and thinking forward. What does that mean? What does that support need to look like? Yeah, I just on the specifics of what's happening at the moment. I mean, the DWP does have pilots running, and I would just say that as always, the DWP, when it looks at its levers that it can pull, it sees Job Centre Plus, and I do think on the issue of in-work progression, we do need to think more widely than Job Centre Plus, not just in terms of individuals engaging with that support, but also employers. Employers are going to be really important to this in-work progression kind of puzzle. So I do think that we need to look at different models of delivery of that career coach support, building the case for a sort of, careers advancement service. As Tony said, that could be enveloped into a wider offer, but that people can sort of look at improving their pay. It will look different for different people. So for somebody who's self-employed, that might be about, growing their business rather than actually their take-home pay. But I do think that this is the next big challenge, and I know that the DWP is starting to tackle it. But I think we need a much more integrated approach to it, because people in their lives will have their own complications and their own reasons why they are in the job they are, and their own caring responsibilities and the ways that they juggle things. So I think that, when we're thinking about careers and career advancement, we need to think about it quite holistically. Yeah, I did want to come in on this question when you asked it earlier, because I think it's a really, really important one about the employment support sector and the DWP. Is if you take the example of Kickstart. So if you look at previous recessions, you've seen that young people are always the hardest impacted in a recession. So that was sort of easy to predict. There were lots of unique factors about this particular recession, but young people are always hardest hit. Now, Kickstart drew on evidence of the Future Jobs Fund. So there was evidence there of what works to support young people into work. They need work experience. There was the wage subsidy scheme. But what actually happened was the DWP then changed that into a sort of more of a wage subsidy scheme that supported young people into work through the private sector. Now, that hadn't been done before, and certainly not done at scale. And I think this is my learning, is about preparedness. Does the DWP have a bank of evidence running at any one time with pilots, with good, what works in employment support, to know that you could scale it up and you'd know the systems that would sit behind it, and you've got experts there in the department who are able to, develop those systems and work with the provider market to implement things at pace that could be turned on and off. Because I think when we look at the example of Kickstart, it was just developed in flight. It was developed, there wasn't the evidence of that particular model that had been done before. Now, why is that? And I think that for me is the learning about this pandemic is, why is there not an easy, readily available bank of evidence, of programs, of what works that can be enacted by providers really quickly, that the DWP knows how to run? And that to me is really, really important. I'm very happy to come in on this. I actually had to look back, Chair, at when the committee actually held its last inquiry on European Social Fund and Shared Prosperity Fund, and it was Steve McCabe brought it to the committee in 2018. It's nearly 4 years ago now, and I would just highlight, you're quite right in sort of pointing out that we do have some of the sums of money in those 4 years sort of outlined, but there's been very little developments in the framework that we're still expecting. The actual amounts of money that were promised initially were 1.5 billion per year for Shared Prosperity Fund, because that sort of averaged out the EU contribution, not the matched funding, which was also provided by Whitehall, but just the EU contribution. The spending review had a sort of ramp up to 1.5 billion, but that's we've got a smaller amount this year, then ramping up in 2 years' time to that 1.5. I don't think we should sort of over-egg it though, because we do have EU receipts that are still coming in, that are still paying for some of the programs. And I'll just sort of flag why do we care about this? Some of the issues that we've flagged around participation, engagement of certain groups in the labour market are those who are being served by European Social Fund programmes. So skilling up, reducing reoffending, helping disabled people into work, neat young people. All of those groups that we've mentioned today are the ones being currently supported by European Social Fund programmes. Now, 4 years ago, we flagged, and your question was about the providers and certainty. 4 years ago, we flagged that providers didn't know what was coming next. They had no certainty over their funding for these really vital programs. And how could they plan how can a business plan for providing services when you don't know what that funding is going to look like? We're 3 months away from April and the Shared Prosperity Fund coming in, and we still don't know. And those providers still don't know. So that is it's not a tap you turn on and off. You can't turn on and off experts who help these groups of people, these communities that we, are all part of the levelling up agenda. We really need much more transparency and certainty over what is going to be funded and how it's going to be funded.